The heroine is the spitting image of the Mafia boss's late wife, a woman who was supposedly killed in an assassination attempt meant for him. To deceive his enemies, he hires her to impersonate his deceased wife at public events. But as they spend more time together, the line between pretense and reality begins to blur, and their fake relationship slowly turns into something real. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The rain in Chicago fell like judgment, hard and cold against the windows of the small gallery on Halsted Street, and Elena Marchetti was 3 brushstrokes away from finishing a forgery she told herself was homage. She didn't hear the bell above the door. She didn't hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the reclaimed oak floor. She only felt the air change, the way a room changes when a predator enters it. And when she turned, she found a man standing utterly still amid the canvases, staring at her as though she were something risen from a grave. He was tall in the particular way of men who had learned to use height as a weapon, dressed in charcoal wool that fit him with the precision of a blade in its sheath. His hair was black, threaded faintly with silver at the temples, though he could not have been older than 35. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Dark, unreadable, and fixed on her face with an intensity that made her fingers tighten around her paintbrush. "Say something," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, a voice that had given orders and never once had to repeat them. "Please, say anything." "Can I help you?" Elena asked, because it was the only sentence her mind could produce. The man flinched, actually flinched, as if her voice had struck him. He took a step back, one hand rising to brace against a display pedestal, and for a moment the terrifying, powerful stranger looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "Who are you?" he demanded, recovering, his voice sharpening into command. "Elena Marchetti. I own the gallery." She set down her brush, wiping paint from her fingers with a rag, buying herself a second to breathe. "And you are?" "Dante Moretti." He said it the way other men said their own names when they expected the words to detonate something in a room. When they didn't, when Elena only frowned, faintly puzzled, clearly having never heard it before, something in his shoulders loosened, though whether from relief or renewed suspicion, she couldn't tell. She knew the name only distantly, the way anyone in Chicago half knew certain names, attached to certain rumors that were never printed in newspapers but circulated anyway, in the hush between people who understood that some families ran the city from beneath it. Moretti. The name belonged to blood and old money and men who disappeared inconvenient people the way other men disposed of trash. "I don't know who that is," she said honestly, which seemed to unsettle him further. He circled her slowly, the way a collector circles a painting he suspects might be a forgery or a masterpiece. It was impossible to tell which he believed her to be. Up close, she could smell cedar and gunmetal and something colder beneath it, like winter air trapped in wool. "Turn your head," he said. "To the left." "Excuse me?" "Please." The word cost him something. Elena could see that plainly. Men like this did not often say please, and when they did, it emerged rusted from disuse. Some instinct, curiosity, or perhaps the electric warning crawling up her spine made her obey. She turned her face toward the grey window light. Dante Moretti made a sound low in his throat, something between a groan and a prayer, and turned away from her entirely, his hand dragging down over his mouth as if to physically hold back whatever admission wanted to escape it. "This isn't possible," he said, to the room, to himself, to whatever gods he no longer believed in. "What isn't possible?" Elena crossed her arms, unnerved now, aware suddenly of how empty the gallery was at 6 in the evening, how the storm outside had emptied the street of witnesses. "Mr. Moretti, if you don't tell me what's going on, I'm going to ask you to leave." He turned back to her, and this time when he looked at her, something in his expression had reorganized itself into control, into the cold, assessing calculation of a man rebuilding a strategy in real time. "My wife," he said quietly, "died 18 months ago, shot in a car meant for me. Her name was Isabella." He paused, watching her face for a reaction she didn't have, because the name meant nothing to her. "You have her face, Miss Marchetti. Not similar to, not reminiscent of, her face. Exactly." Elena felt the cold slide down her spine like a hand. I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but that has nothing to do with me. I've lived in Chicago my whole life. I've never met your wife. I've never even heard the name Moretti before tonight." "I believe you," he said, which surprised her. "That's what makes this so much worse." Outside, thunder rolled over the lake, and Dante Moretti reached into his coat and produced a card, black with silver lettering, and set it on the pedestal beside her half-finished forgery of a Klimt. "I'm going to make you an offer," he said. "You will want to refuse it. I am asking you not to, before you've heard the terms." He looked at her one more time, that same hungry, haunted look, as if he were trying to memorize her, or exorcise her. She couldn't say which. "Because whether you believe me or not, Miss Marchetti, there are men in this city who would kill you the moment they saw your face, simply for the crime of wearing it." He left without waiting for her answer, the bell above the door ringing once into the rain, and Elena Marchetti stood alone in her gallery, holding a business card that felt, absurdly, like the edge of a cliff. She didn't call the number for 3 days. She told herself this was because the man was clearly unhinged, some grief-drunk stranger who'd mistaken a passing resemblance for a haunting. She told herself the smart thing, the sane thing, was to burn the card in the kitchen sink and forget the rain-soaked stranger who had looked at her like she was a wound reopening. But on the second night, someone followed her home. She noticed the car first, a black sedan, windows tinted past legal limit, idling half a block from the gallery when she locked up at 9. It followed her at a distance so precise it could only be intentional, peeling off only when she reached the doorman of her building on Dearborn, and the doorman, an older man named Walt, who had known her since she moved in, gave her a strange look and said, "Friend of yours, Miss Marchetti? Fella came by asking after you this afternoon. Real polite. Real scary." That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the black card between 2 fingers, turning it over and over, and at 2 in the morning she finally understood that whatever Dante Moretti had started by walking into her gallery, it could not be undone by ignoring it. Some doors, once opened, didn't close again just because you wanted them to. She called at 9 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, as though he had been holding the phone the entire time. Miss Marchetti, someone followed me home last night. Not someone of mine. His voice sharpened, urgent in a way that startled her. Describe the car. She did. There was a silence, long enough that she thought the call had dropped, and then he said, quiet and grim, "Don't leave your apartment. I'm sending a car, not to threaten you, to protect you. You can refuse it, but I'd advise against it, given what you just told me." "I don't even know what's happening," Elena said, and hated how her voice cracked on the last word. Hated that fear had found its way in so easily. "I know," Dante said, and for the first time his voice held something like tenderness, buried deep beneath the granite. "I'll explain everything, I promise you that. Just let me keep you safe first. Explanations later." The car arrived 20 minutes later, driven by a broad-shouldered young man who introduced himself only as Sal and said almost nothing else for the entire drive, though his eyes tracked every vehicle behind them with an alertness that told Elena this was not his first time running counter-surveillance. They didn't take her to some seedy warehouse or back-alley social club, which she had half expected, steeling herself for danger the entire ride. Instead, the car glided to a stop before a glass tower on North Michigan Avenue, 60 stories of mirrored steel catching the grey morning light, and Sal escorted her to a private elevator that required a key rather than a button. The penthouse, when the doors opened onto it, took her breath in a way she resented. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the lake in a wide grey sweep. Furniture in deep charcoal and cream, art on the walls that she recognized instantly as originals, a small Rothko, an early Twombly, wealth so absolute it had stopped needing to announce itself. Dante Moretti stood at the window with his back to her, a study in expensive stillness, and when he turned, the haunted look from the gallery had been replaced by something colder, more composed. A man who had spent the last 3 days constructing an argument and intended to deliver it flawlessly. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the sofa. "Please." She sat, because her legs had begun to shake and she didn't want him to see it. 18 months ago, he began, my wife Isabella was killed in a car bombing outside a restaurant on Taylor Street. The bomb was meant for me. She insisted on riding with me that night against my objections, and she died in my place. The men responsible were the Cardinali family, rivals of my organization for 3 generations. We have been at war with them, quietly, viciously, ever since. "I'm so sorry," Elena said, and meant it, even though the world he described felt like something out of a film she'd fallen asleep during. "The war has not gone well for either side," Dante continued, ignoring the sympathy as though accepting it might cost him something he couldn't afford. "Both families are exhausted. Both families are bleeding money and men. There is, for the first time in years, a genuine possibility of peace, a summit brokered by neutral families that could end this before it kills what's left of both of us." He paused, and something flickered behind his eyes, quick as a struck match. "But peace requires strength. It requires the Cardinalis to believe I am not weakened by grief. It requires them to see that my house still stands whole, that my wife, whose murder they will never openly admit to, did not break me." Elena felt the shape of the offer before he said it, dread pooling cold in her stomach. "You want me to pretend to be her?" "I want to hire you," Dante corrected, "to appear as Isabella at a series of public events over the coming weeks, dinners, a charity gala, the summit itself, nothing more. You would be paid extraordinarily well, protected at every moment by my men, and once the summit concludes, you would return to your life with more money than you've made in a decade of painting other people's masterpieces. His eyes flicked deliberately toward her easel-stained fingers, and she realized with a jolt that he'd had her investigated thoroughly. And if I say no? Something in his jaw tightened. Then I will do everything in my power to keep you safe regardless, because the men who follow you now already know your face matches hers, and that alone makes you a target, whether you help me or not. But I would be lying if I said your refusal wouldn't make that far more difficult. Elena sat in the vast, cold silence of the penthouse, staring at a stranger who wore grief like armor and calculation like a second skin, and understood that she had already lost the argument the moment the sedan followed her home. "I need to think," she said. "Take the night," Dante said. "But, Ms. Marchetti, don't disappear on me. I would have to look for you, and I don't think either of us wants to know how thoroughly I'd search." It wasn't quite a threat. It wasn't quite not one either. She said yes 2 days later, in his office, across a desk of black glass, and signed a contract that specified nothing about danger and everything about money. A sum so large it made her hand hesitate above the signature line. Not from greed, but from the dizzying sense that she was selling something she couldn't name yet. "You'll need this," Dante said, sliding a slim folder across the desk once the ink had dried. Inside were photographs. Isabella Moretti at 18 different ages and events, in gowns and in grief, laughing beside Dante at some vineyard in Tuscany, standing rigid beside him at a funeral. Elena studied the woman's face and felt the strange vertigo of looking into a mirror that reflected a stranger's life. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the small mole beneath the left eye, the particular arch of the brow. "How did she die, exactly?" Elena asked, unable to stop herself. Dante's jaw worked once before he answered. "The car she was riding in exploded 4 blocks from the restaurant where we'd had dinner. I identified her by a ring on what remained of her hand. There wasn't enough left for an open casket." His voice had gone flat, professionally so, the voice of a man reciting a story he had told himself so many times the horror had calcified into fact. The Cardinales have never admitted responsibility, which is its own kind of confession in this world. Everyone knows. No one can prove it. That's how these wars are fought. "I'm sorry," Elena said again, and this time he looked at her instead of past her, something raw moving briefly across his face before the composure slammed back down like a portcullis. "You'll need training," he said instead, standing abruptly, putting the desk and several feet of very expensive carpet between them. Isabella's mannerisms, her voice, the people she knew and the ones she didn't. "My sister-in-law, Camilla, will help you. She's the only one who can be trusted with this. My father doesn't know, and he cannot know, not yet, not until it's finished." "Your father doesn't know you're hiring a woman to impersonate his dead daughter-in-law?" "My father," Dante said, with the particular weariness of a man who had spent his whole life managing an impossible parent, "would tell me I am a fool to risk exposure for something so fragile as an illusion. He may be right. But I have run the numbers on peace, and I have run the numbers on continued war, and peace wins by a margin wide enough that I am willing to gamble a great deal to secure it." He looked at her then, and something in his gaze sharpened into an honesty she hadn't expected. "Including you, Miss Marchetti, which I recognize is not a small thing to ask of a stranger."
"No," Elena agreed quietly. "It isn't."
Camilla Moretti turned out to be a whip-thin woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, who spent the following 2 weeks drilling Elena in the particulars of a dead woman's life with the brisk efficiency of someone building a soldier out of raw civilian material. Isabella had grown up in Palermo, moved to America at 19, spoke Italian with a Sicilian lilt that Elena, whose grandmother had come from Calabria, could approximate but never perfectly reproduce, a fact Camilla dismissed with a wave of her hand. "No one will test your Italian that closely," Camilla said one afternoon, pouring espresso in the penthouse kitchen while Elena struggled through a phrase for the 4th time. "They will be too busy staring at your face to notice your vowels." That's the entire point, isn't it? You are not required to be her, you are required to make them believe they're looking at her for exactly as long as it takes to walk through a room. "And Dante?" Elena asked, because the question had been building in her for days. "What does he believe when he looks at me?" Camilla's expression softened into something almost pitying. "That," she said, "is the question that frightens me most, Cara. Because I have watched that man since he was 22 years old, and I have never once seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. Not even her." She set down the espresso cup with a small, decisive clink. "Be careful. Grief makes men do strange things with hope, and hope in this family has a very short life expectancy." That night, Elena stood at the penthouse windows long after Camilla had gone home, watching the lights of the city smear against the glass in the rain, and did not hear Dante enter until his reflection appeared beside hers. "You're staying late," he said. "Camilla thinks you're falling for a ghost you dressed me up to resemble." She hadn't meant to say it so bluntly. The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment Dante said nothing at all, his reflection unreadable in the dark glass. "Camilla," he said finally, "is really wrong about anything." He left before she could ask what that meant, and Elena stood alone at the window, with her heart beating too fast for a woman who told herself over and over that this was only a job. The first event was a dinner at a private club on Lakeshore Drive, hosted by the Alessandri family, neutral brokers in the peace talks, and Elena spent 4 hours beforehand in the hands of a stylist who dressed her in emerald silk that had, Camilla informed her without ceremony, belonged to Isabella herself, pulled from a closet no one had opened in 18 months. She felt the dead woman's dress settle against her skin like a second, colder layer. "You look extraordinary," Dante said when she emerged from the dressing room, and something in the way he said it made her chest ache. Not flattery, but a kind of devastated wonder, a man witnessing a resurrection he had stopped believing in and could no longer entirely disbelieve. "I look like her," Elena corrected softly. "Yes," Dante said. "That too." The club, when they arrived, was a hushed cathedral of old wealth. Dark wood, low lighting, men in bespoke suits who kissed cheeks and shook hands with the practiced warmth of people who had learned generations ago that violence and civility were not opposites, but complements. Elena walked in on Dante's arm with her spine locked rigid, terrified that the first person to look closely at her would see straight through the silk and the makeup to the fraud beneath. Instead, a silence rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Moretti, breathed an older man near the bar, his glass frozen halfway to his lips, and Elena understood with a lurch of vertigo that she had just become a ghost in front of 40 witnesses.
Dante's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at the small of her back, not possessive, or not only that, but steadying, an anchor thrown to a woman drowning in someone else's life. "Buonasera," Elena said, in the careful, Camilla-drilled accent, and watched relief and horror chase each other across the older man's face in equal measure. Dinner passed in a blur of careful conversation, Elena speaking only when spoken to, deflecting deeper questions with the vague, grief-softened non-answers Camilla had rehearsed with her for a week. It was during dessert that a woman across the table, young, sharp-eyed, introduced as a Cardinale cousin, present as a gesture of goodwill, leaned forward with a smile too bright to be kind. "Isabella," the woman said, "I always admired your bracelet." "The one with the sapphires, from your engagement. You're not wearing it tonight?" The table went very still. Elena felt the trap close around her a half-second before she understood its shape. There had never been a sapphire bracelet, she realized, watching Camilla's face flicker with the smallest, fastest warning from 3 seats down. It was a test. "I stopped wearing it," Elena said, letting her voice drop into something quiet and wounded, reaching for the one truth available to her, grief itself. Borrowed, but not entirely false, since some part of her had spent 2 weeks absorbing a dead woman's sorrow until it had become, strangely, her own. After everything. It felt like tempting fate twice. It was the correct answer, she understood, only because it revealed nothing and confirmed nothing, wrapped in enough real sadness to disarm suspicion. The Cardinale cousin's smile faltered, recalibrating, and beside her, Dante's hand found Elena's beneath the tablecloth, squeezing once, hard, before releasing. "You did well," the touch said, more clearly than words could have. Afterward, in the car, the adrenaline finally broke through her composure, and Elena's hands began to shake violently in her lap. Dante noticed instantly, reaching across the seat to still them between both of his own, his palms warm and impossibly large around her cold fingers. "You did everything right," he said, low. "She was testing me. She knew. She suspected. There's a difference, and you closed it." He was quiet a moment, studying her hands still trembling in his. "You handled it better than most people who've known me for 20 years would have." "I don't want to do that again," Eleanor whispered. "I know," Dante said. "I'm sorry I need you to." The apology surprised her more than anything else that night. A man who commanded fear from grown men in silk suits, apologizing to her in the back of a bulletproof car for the danger he'd put her in. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw beneath the cold architecture of his face something that looked almost like shame, and beneath that something that looked like the beginning of a hunger he was fighting very hard to keep leashed. "Dante," she said, testing his name in her mouth for the first time, without the surname, without the title. He looked at her sharply, as if the sound of it had physically struck him. "Say it again," he said, and his voice had gone rough, in a way that had nothing to do with grief. She didn't. She looked away instead, out the window at the city sliding past in ribbons of light, because some instinct told her that if she said his name again, in that car, in that silence, something would happen that neither of them could take back.
3 miles away, in an apartment above a shuttered bakery on Taylor Street, a woman watched security footage on a laptop stolen from a rival's mistress and felt something ancient and possessive twist beneath her ribs. Isabella Cardinali, born Isabella Rossi, married into the Moretti name only long enough to learn every weakness the family possessed before staging her own death, paused the frame on Elena's face, emerald silk glowing in low light, Dante's hand at the small of her back. "She's wearing my dress," Isabella said quietly, to the empty room, to the version of herself that still believed she deserved everything she'd built and lost. The plan had been simple once: marry into the Moretti Empire, extract its secrets over 3 careful years, then die spectacularly enough that no one would ever look for her among the living, and let the resulting war between the Morettis and her true family, the Cardinalis, weaken both sides so thoroughly that when she returned, years later, under a new name, with new leverage, she could pick through the wreckage of both empires like a queen surveying a battlefield she alone had orchestrated. The car bomb had been her idea. The ring left on a stranger's severed hand had been her idea. Grief, she had learned early in life, was the only weapon that could not be defended against, because it disarmed suspicion in the same motion that it destroyed a man from the inside. She had not planned on Dante finding a replacement. She had certainly not planned on the replacement being so precisely, uncannily her own face that even watching the footage now, Isabella felt a strange vertigo, as if she were observing herself from outside her own body. Still married, still beloved, still standing in the exact spot in that dining room where she had once charmed men twice her age into revealing shipment routes and account numbers. He mourned me, she thought, watching Dante's hand at Elena's back with something between satisfaction and fury. He mourned me exactly the way I needed him to. And now he's fallen in love with a copy of the woman he thinks he lost. The irony was almost funny. It would have been funny if it didn't threaten everything she had spent 2 years building from the shadows, a network of new loyalties inside the Cardinali organization, a slow accumulation of blackmail material against 3 separate captains, all of it aimed at the day she would resurface and claim not just her old life, but a throne twice the size of the one she'd abandoned. A resurrected Isabella returning to find Dante remarried, or worse, genuinely in love with some pliant art forger from Halsted Street, was not a complication. It was an existential threat to a decade of planning. She closed the laptop and dialed a number she had used exactly 4 times in 18 months, each time for something that required absolute discretion and absolute violence. "I need you to find out everything about a woman named Elena Marchetti," Isabella said when the call connected. "Family, friends, weaknesses, and I need it to look like an accident whenever I decide the time has come." "And the timeline?" the voice on the other end asked. Isabella looked out the grimy window at the grey sliver of lake visible between 2 buildings, thinking of sapphire bracelets and dresses that weren't hers to wear, and felt something cold and patient settle into place behind her ribs, old as bone. "Not yet," she said. "Let her fall in love with him first. It will make the ending so much worse." The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm Elena hadn't expected to find comfort in.
Mornings with Camilla, drilling accent and etiquette. Afternoons at the penthouse, reviewing photographs and correcting the small tics that made her walk, her laugh, her posture drift from Isabella's toward her own. And evenings, increasingly, alone with Dante, in rooms too large for two people, filled with silences that grew less and less uncomfortable each time. He never touched her without reason. That was, perhaps, the most dangerous thing about him, the discipline of it, the way his hand found the small of her back only when a room required the illusion of intimacy, the way his eyes lingered a half-second too long only when he believed she wasn't watching him watch her. Elena found herself cataloguing these lapses the way a scientist catalogues anomalies, small deviations from a controlled system that suggested something was straining beneath the surface. "Tell me about her," Elena said one evening, 3 weeks in, as they sat across from each other at the penthouse dining table over food neither of them had touched. "Not the mannerisms, not the accent. Tell me who she actually was." Dante set down his fork slowly, and for a moment she thought he would deflect, the way he deflected every question that cut too close to the architecture of his grief. "She was clever," he said instead, surprising her. "Cleverer than anyone gave her credit for, myself included. She could read a room in 10 seconds and know exactly which version of herself it needed. I used to think that was a gift." He paused, something dark crossing his face. "Lately, I've wondered if it was something else." "What do you mean?" "Nothing." He shook his head, as if physically dislodging the thought. "Grief invents suspicions. It's easier to be angry at a dead woman than to simply miss her." Elena studied him across the candlelight, this man built entirely of controlled surfaces, and felt an unfamiliar tenderness rise in her chest, unbidden and unwelcome. "Do you still love her?" The question hung in the air between them like something breakable. Dante's jaw worked once, twice before he answered. "I loved the woman I thought I married," he said finally. "I'm no longer certain how much of her was real." His eyes lifted to hers, dark and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "But I know that when I look at you now, Elena, I'm no longer thinking about her at all. And that terrifies me more than anything the Cardinalis have ever done to my family." The use of her name, not Isabella's, hers, struck her like a physical blow. He had never called her Elena before, not once, always some variation of Ms. Marchetti in front of others, and nothing at all when they were alone, as if naming her risked collapsing the fragile architecture holding the deception upright. "Dante," she whispered. He stood abruptly, putting distance between them with the same violent efficiency he brought to every threat in his life, as though her name in her own mouth had become one. "You should go home," he said, voice rough. "It's late." "Is that what you want?" He turned back to her, and the mask cracked entirely, just for a moment, revealing something raw and starving beneath it. "No," he said. "God help me, it isn't. But wanting things has never worked out well for the people I love, Elena. I would rather send you home safe and wanting than keep you here and lose you the way I lost everything else." She left that night without arguing, because some part of her recognized the shape of his fear, the particular grief of a man who had learned that love, in his world, was simply another word for a target painted on someone's back. But she carried his voice home with her, the way he'd said her name, and lay awake long after midnight replaying it, understanding with dawning terrible clarity that whatever this had started as, it had stopped being only a job weeks ago, and neither of them had said so out loud. The charity gala at the Drake Hotel was, by every account that mattered, the largest test yet. 300 guests, a dozen rival families, journalists at the periphery who couldn't be paid to look away entirely, and the first appearance of Salvatore Cardinali himself, the family patriarch, a man Dante described in the car beforehand with a single, chilling sentence. He ordered the bombing that killed my wife, and he has never once had to answer for it. Elena's hands were steady, at least, a small mercy she credited entirely to weeks of practice, as Dante led her into the ballroom beneath a chandelier the size of a small car. Isabella's sapphire earrings, the real ones, retrieved from a safe deposit box Dante had not opened in 18 months, cold against her throat. Salvatore Cardinali found them within the first 20 minutes, moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life feared consequence. A silver-haired figure in a suit so perfectly cut it looked like a second skin. "Dante," he said, extending a hand that Dante shook with a coldness so total it was itself a kind of violence. "And Isabella, my God, every time I see you, I forget you're gone." His eyes moved over her face with an attention that made Elena's skin crawl, cataloguing and comparing with a precision that felt, disturbingly, less like grief-shocked recognition and more like verification. "You look wonderful, my dear. Truly." "Thank you, Mr. Cardinali," Elena said, in Isabella's careful, accented cadence, forcing her spine to stay loose, unthreatened. "Tell me," Salvatore continued, his smile never wavering, "do you still take your coffee the Sicilian way? Bitter, no sugar? I remember you insisting on it at our daughter's christening, scandalizing my sister-in-law." His eyes glittered, sharp as knives beneath the chandelier light. The trap, again. More specific this time, more dangerous, because Elena had no memory to draw on, no Camilla-drilled fact to retrieve. She felt Dante go rigid beside her, his hand finding hers, and understood in that half-second that whatever she said next could unmake everything they'd built. "I've changed a great deal since then, Salvatore," she said instead, letting a small, cool smile play at her mouth, borrowing every ounce of Isabella's reputed cleverness that Dante had described to her days before. "Grief does that. You, of all people, should understand how much a person can change after losing what matters most." It was a blade disguised as a platitude, an accusation wrapped in grief, implying without stating that she knew precisely what role he'd played in her death, daring him to push further and reveal his own guilt in the process. Salvatore's smile faltered for exactly one heartbeat before recovering, and in that heartbeat, Elena saw something flicker behind his eyes that looked almost like respect. "Of course," he murmured. "Forgive me. Enjoy your evening, both of you." He melted back into the crowd, and Dante's hand tightened around hers, hard enough to bruise, his voice a bare thread of breath at her ear. "That," he said, "was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've ever watched anyone do in front of that man." "Did I pass?" "You didn't just pass," Dante said, something like awe cracking through his careful control. "You made him doubt himself for the first time in years." Later, on the terrace, away from the noise and the chandeliers, Elena finally let her hands shake, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up to her body all at once. Dante found her there within minutes, shrugging off his jacket and settling it over her bare shoulders before she could protest, his hands lingering a moment too long at her collarbones. "You could have told me the coffee story was a trap," she said. "I didn't know it was coming. I'm sorry." His voice had dropped into something quieter, rawer, stripped of the ballroom's performance. "You terrify me. Do you know that? Not because of what you might do wrong, because of how completely, effortlessly right you keep getting everything. As though you were always meant to stand in that room, wearing her jewelry, speaking her language, and I keep forgetting, for entire minutes at a time, that you're not her at all." Is that a compliment or a warning? Both, Dante admitted, and then, before either of them could stop it, his hand rose to cup her jaw, thumb tracing the small mole beneath her eye that had started this entire, impossible collision of two lives. "I think about you when you're not in the room, Elena. I think about you constantly, and I hate it. Because every version of this story I can imagine ends with you in danger because of me. Maybe let me decide what risks are worth taking," she whispered, leaning almost imperceptibly into his palm. For a moment, one suspended, terrace-lit, lake-wind moment, she thought he might close the distance entirely. Instead, he exhaled shakily and stepped back, jaw tight with the effort of restraint. "Not tonight," he said. "Not like this. Not while you're still wearing her earrings." He met her eyes, something fierce and vowed burning there. "When it happens, and God help me, Elena, I think it's going to happen. I want it to be you I'm kissing, not the ghost standing in for her." He offered his arm instead, formal and correct, and led her back into the ballroom's golden light, and Elena walked beside him, with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it, wondering how much longer either of them could survive pretending this was only ever a job. Salvatore Cardinali left the gala troubled, in a way he hadn't been in years. And troubled men in his family made phone calls that rippled outward through their organization like stones dropped into still water. She knew, he told his daughter Isabella, not by that name, never by that name in front of anyone who might overhear, but by the alias she'd built her second life around, Sophia, over an untraceable line 2 hours after the gala ended. Or she's cleverer than any grieving widow has a right to be. That woman answered me with your exact tone, your exact cruelty. Isabella, sitting in her dim apartment above the shuttered bakery, felt something cold and vindicated settle over her at her father's assessment, wrapped tight around a fury that had no clean outlet. "She's an imitation," she said. "A good one. It doesn't mean anything. It means Dante Moretti is not weakened by grief the way we hoped," Salvatore corrected, his voice hard with the particular disappointment of a man watching a decade of careful war strategy complicate itself in real time. "It means he found a way to project strength precisely where we expected fracture. If the summit proceeds with both families believing themselves stable, we lose our advantage entirely." "Then we remove the advantage," Isabella said. "Expose her as a fraud, publicly, at the summit itself. Let every family in that room watch Dante Moretti's carefully constructed piece collapse the moment they realize he's been staging his own grief for an audience."
And how do you propose we prove it?
Isabella smiled into the phone, an expression her father couldn't see but would have recognized instantly. The same cold calculation that had once made her the most valuable asset the Cardinali family had ever planted inside enemy territory. "Leave that to me," she said. "I have resources you don't know about, Papa. I've been patient for 18 months. I can be patient for a few weeks more." She ended the call and sat alone in the dark, turning over the plan that had been forming since the moment she first saw the security footage of Elena Marchetti wearing her sapphire earrings, walking the halls of a life that still, by every rite of blood and vow and violence, belonged to her alone. The plan had 3 parts, each one crueler than the last, and Isabella had spent long enough in the shadows to know that cruelty, deployed correctly, was simply another word for precision. First, she would ensure Elena Marchetti learned the truth of who she was pretending for, not the sanitized version Dante had surely fed her, but the real one, poisoned enough to plant seeds of doubt that would grow, slowly, into paranoia. Second, she would make contact with Elena directly, under a false identity, and befriend the woman whose face she had once worn, close enough to learn her weaknesses and far enough to never be suspected. Third, and this was the part Isabella lingered on longest, savouring it the way she savoured very little else in her carefully constructed exile, she would let Dante Moretti fall completely, irrevocably in love with a woman he believed to be building something new. And then she would return from the dead at precisely the moment his guard was lowest, and watch the life he thought he'd rebuilt collapse into ash around him. She opened her laptop and began, methodically, to build the false identity that would carry her into Elena Marchetti's life. A gallery contact, an art buyer, someone with a plausible reason to cross paths with a struggling painter turned reluctant impersonator. It took her 3 days to construct the persona fully. Sophia Renzi, an art consultant recently relocated from New York, cultured, warm, exactly the kind of ally a woman drowning in an impossible double life might desperately want. By the end of the week, Sophia Renzi had walked into Elena's gallery on Halsted Street with a bottle of wine and an offer to represent 3 of her paintings to a private collector. And Elena, exhausted and lonely and starved for a friendship untangled from Mafia politics, had welcomed her in without a second thought. It was, Isabella thought, watching Elena's genuine, unguarded smile from behind a mask that had once been her own face, almost too easy. Sophia Renzi became, over the following 2 weeks, the closest thing to a friend Elena had allowed herself since this entire ordeal began. She was warm where Camilla was brisk, curious where Dante was guarded, and she asked questions about Elena's actual life, her art, her childhood, her fears, with a genuine seeming interest that felt, after weeks of being trained to disappear into someone else's identity, like water in a desert. "You look tired," Sophia said one afternoon, over coffee at a small cafe blocks from the gallery, her dark eyes sharp with concern that Elena had no reason yet to distrust. "This arrangement of yours, forgive me, I don't pretend to understand the details, only that you're clearly under enormous strain. Is it worth it?" "I don't know anymore," Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty, the coffee and the unfamiliar safety of Sophia's presence, loosening something in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks. "I took this job for money and safety. Now I'm not sure what I'm doing it for." "Because of him," Sophia said. It wasn't a question. Elena didn't answer, which was answer enough.
Be careful, Sophia said, reaching across the table to squeeze Elena's hand, her expression softening into something that looked, convincingly, like worry for a friend. I've heard things about Dante Moretti in my line of work. Art moves through the same circles as money like his, cara. People talk. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue, a performance Isabella had practiced for hours in front of a mirror. They say his wife's death wasn't as simple as the official story. They say there were people close to him who wondered if perhaps he arranged it himself to remove her before she discovered something dangerous she wasn't meant to know. The suggestion landed in Elena's chest like a dropped stone, cold and sudden. That's not... Dante loved her. Anyone can see that. He's still grieving her. Grief is easy to perform, Sophia said gently, for men who have spent their whole lives performing strength. I only tell you this because I care about you, Elena. I'd hate to see you fall for a man capable of erasing an inconvenient wife, only to become his next inconvenience yourself. Elena went home that night, with the seed planted exactly where Isabella had intended it, turning the suggestion over and over in her mind until small, previously insignificant moments took on sinister new shapes. The flatness in Dante's voice whenever he described Isabella's death, his refusal to discuss the details of the investigation, the way even Camilla's warm regard for him carried, sometimes, an undercurrent of caution Elena had noticed but never examined. She didn't confront him that night or the next, but the doubt Sophia had planted grew roots in the silence, and Elena found herself watching Dante with a new, uneasy attention. Not the attention of a woman falling in love, but of a woman beginning, despite herself, to wonder if she'd trusted the wrong things too quickly. Isabella, watching from the shadows of her own careful construction, felt the first small satisfaction of a plan taking root exactly as intended. It would take more than one seed of doubt to bring down what Dante and Elena had built between them. She understood that, understood the particular stubbornness of a real, growing love once it had taken hold. But doubt, like poison, rarely needed to work quickly. It only needed to work steadily, drop by drop, until the day it mattered most. She closed her laptop, where she'd been reviewing the day's photographs of Elena leaving the cafe looking shaken, and allowed herself, for the first time in 18 months, something close to hope that her old life might yet be reclaimed in full. Her husband, her house, her throne, and the particular satisfaction of watching the woman who dared to wear her face destroyed by the very love she'd been foolish enough to believe in. Elena confronted Dante 4 days later, in the penthouse, over a dinner that had gone cold between them, while she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been eating at her since the cafe. "Did you kill her?" she asked, without preamble, watching his face for the flicker of guilt or offence that would tell her everything. Dante went very still, fork frozen halfway to his plate, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the city 60 stories below. "Where did you hear that?" His voice had gone dangerously quiet, a register she hadn't heard from him before, one that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. "Is it true?" "No." The word came out sharp, wounded, entirely unlike the careful control he usually maintained. "I loved her, Elena. Whatever else was true about her, whatever I've since begun to suspect. I would have died in that car myself before I let anything happen to her. That's the entire tragedy of it. She insisted on riding with me that night. I couldn't stop her." His hands, Elena noticed, had begun to shake almost imperceptibly against the table, an admission of grief he rarely allowed to surface. Who told you this? A friend, someone in the art world. She said people whisper about it, that some in your organization wondered if you removed her because she'd learned something dangerous. Something shifted behind Dante's eyes, sharp and sudden, the fury replaced instantly by a colder, more focused alertness. What friend? Her name is Sophia Renzi, an art consultant. Describe her.
His voice had gone flat, professional, the voice of a man assembling a threat assessment in real time. Elena did, and watched Dante's face pale by degrees as she spoke, the dark hair, the particular way Sophia held herself, small mannerisms Elena hadn't thought twice about until she watched them register on Dante's face as something far more significant than a chance resemblance. "When did you meet her?" he asked, voice tight. 2 weeks ago. She came into the gallery, offered to represent some of my paintings. "Dante, you're frightening me. What's happening?" He stood abruptly, crossing to the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Elena had never heard from him, not even in the worst of their earlier tension. "I need you to tell me everything about her, every detail, where you met, what she said, what she looked like, everything." Elena obliged, watching him grow more rigid with each sentence, and by the time she finished, Dante had gone silent for nearly a full minute, staring out at the lake as though it held answers written somewhere in its dark water. "Dante, please, you're scaring me." "I need to show you something," he said finally, turning back to her, his face carved from something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely afraid. He crossed to a locked drawer in the study, retrieved a photograph, and set it on the table between them without a word. Elena stared down at a woman in the photograph, younger, laughing, standing beside a much younger Dante at what looked like a vineyard, and felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It was Sophia's face. Unmistakably, impossibly, Sophia's face. Wearing an engagement ring Elena had seen once before, in a folder of photographs Dante had shown her weeks ago. The ring identified as belonging to Isabella Moretti. "That's her," Elena whispered. "That's Sophia. That's my wife," Dante said, his voice breaking entirely on the last word. All the careful architecture of his control, finally, completely collapsing. "That's Isabella. Which means she's alive, Elena. She's been alive this entire time." The revelation detonated through the penthouse like the very bomb that had supposedly ended Isabella Moretti's life 18 months earlier. And for a long moment, neither Elena nor Dante spoke. The silence stretched taut between two people trying to reassemble an entire understanding of reality around a single, impossible photograph. "She's alive," Elena repeated, her voice hollow, the ground of everything she'd built over the past 2 months tilting sideways beneath her. "She's been alive this whole time, and she came to me. She sat across from me at a cafe and told me you might have killed her." "Which means she's not just alive," Dante said, his voice a low, controlled fury that Elena had never heard from him before, terrifying in its total absence of the grief that had defined him since the day they'd met. "She's been running her own war this entire time. Watching us, feeding you lies to turn you against me." He raked a hand through his hair, pacing now, a caged animal working through the implications with the speed of a man whose entire career depended on rapid, ruthless calculation. "The car bombing wasn't an attack on me by the Cardinales. It was staged by her, which means she's Cardinale," Elena finished, the pieces sliding into terrible alignment. Not just tolerated by them, part of them. She married you to spy on your family. And when she'd learned enough, Dante said grimly, she staged her own death to disappear before we uncovered what she'd taken, and let a war she'd manufactured burn both families down while she waited in the shadows. He stopped pacing, turned to Elena with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the cold command of the Mafia boss, not the grief-stricken widower, but something rawer, more frightened, a man watching the foundation of his entire adult life crumble in real time. Elena, I need you to understand something. Everything I believed about my marriage, about her death, about the reasons for this war, all of it may have been a lie, constructed by a woman clever enough to fool me for 3 years. I don't know what's true anymore. Except this. He crossed the room to her, taking her hands in both of his grip fierce and shaking. I know that whatever she wants now, it involves destroying you. She came to you specifically. She planted doubt specifically to turn you against me, which means she sees you as a threat to something she still wants. What could she possibly still want? She staged her own death. She left. Me, Dante said quietly, or what I represent. The empire, the name. Whatever she was building toward when she disappeared, it required patience, and patience means she intends to come back and claim it eventually. You becoming real to me, becoming someone I might actually love instead of a tool for a performance, that changes her calculations entirely. Elena felt the weight of it settle over her slowly, cold and absolute. She's going to come after me. Not while I'm breathing, Dante said, and the fierceness in his voice startled her, raw and immediate, stripped of every careful calculation that usually governed his words. I have spent 18 months mourning a woman who was never dead, grieving a lie so thorough it nearly destroyed me. I will not spend another 18 months mourning a woman who is actually real, actually good, actually everything Isabella only pretended to be. I won't allow it, Elena. Do you understand me? The intensity of it, the raw, unguarded fury and fear tangled together in his voice, broke something loose in Elena's chest that she'd been holding back for weeks, every careful boundary she'd built around what this arrangement was supposed to be. She closed the distance between them before she could talk herself out of it, her hands rising to frame his face, feeling the fine tremor still running through him. Then don't let her win, she whispered. Don't let her turn this into another performance. I'm not her, Dante. I never was. Whatever you feel when you look at me, I need it to be real. I need it to be mine. It is, he said, and this time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no careful restraint, no ghost standing between them in a borrowed dress. It was raw and searching, and entirely, finally real. Two people who had spent weeks circling an inevitability, finally allowing themselves to fall into it, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that contradicted every cold, dangerous thing she'd first believed about him. Hers fisting in the front of his shirt, as if she could anchor herself against the storm that had just upended everything she thought she understood. When they finally broke apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together in the dim light of the penthouse, Dante's voice came out rough and certain in a way she'd never heard from him before. I love you, he said. Not her. You, Elena. I don't care how impossible that sounds after 2 months. I know it the way I know my own name. I love you too, Elena whispered back, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like something inevitable.
something that had been building since the moment he'd walked into her gallery in the rain and looked at her like a resurrection he didn't dare believe in. Outside the penthouse windows, the city glittered on, indifferent to the two people inside, finally admitting what had grown between them. And 3 miles away, in a dim apartment above a shuttered bakery, Isabella Cardinali watched a live feed from a camera she'd had installed in the penthouse study weeks earlier, and felt every carefully constructed plan she'd built curdle into something far more dangerous than mere ambition. Jealousy, she was discovering, made an excellent architect of ruin. The Peace Summit was 7 days away, and the discovery of Isabella's survival transformed the remaining preparations from a delicate performance into something closer to open warfare, waged now on 2 fronts simultaneously: the fragile diplomacy between 2 Mafia families and the far more personal war Dante now understood his supposedly dead wife had been waging against him from the shadows all along. "We can't expose her publicly," Dante said, pacing his study while Camilla and Elena sat across from him, the 3 of them working through the wreckage of a plan that had just detonated. "Not yet. If we reveal at the summit that Isabella staged her death and has been operating as a Cardinali asset this entire time, we destroy any chance of peace. Her father would deny everything, claim we fabricated evidence to sabotage the talks, and the war resumes worse than before."
"Then what do we do?" Camilla asked, her sharp eyes moving between Dante and Elena with an assessment Elena couldn't quite read. "Pretend we don't know? Let her keep circling?" "We use the knowledge," Dante said grimly, quietly. "We find out exactly what she's built inside the Cardinali organization, what leverage she's accumulated, and we dismantle it before she can use it. And we protect Elena." His eyes found hers across the room, dark with an intensity that hadn't faded since the kiss they'd shared days earlier, if anything grown sharper, more possessive, edged now with genuine fear. "She's already proven she'll come after you directly. That doesn't change because we know her face now. If anything, it accelerates." "I'm not hiding," Elena said, before either of them could suggest it. "I've spent 2 months learning to walk into rooms full of men who could kill me without blinking. I'm not going to cower in this penthouse while she plots against us from the shadows." "No one's asking you to cower," Camilla said, something like approval flickering across her sharp features. "But you should know what you're facing, Cara. I knew Isabella for 3 years before she died, before she supposedly died. She was the most patient, most controlled person I've ever met. If she's decided to destroy something, she won't do it quickly, and she won't do it in a way anyone can trace back to her cleanly. She'll want it to hurt. She'll want Dante to watch." The word settled over the room like a shadow, and Elena felt the true weight of what she'd walked into finally crystallize. Not simply danger, but a calculated, personal cruelty aimed specifically at unmaking the fragile, real thing that had grown between her and Dante over the past 2 months. That night, unable to sleep, Elena found Dante on the terrace, staring out at the lake with a whiskey he hadn't touched, cradled in one hand. "Tell me about her," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Not the version you told me before, the real one, now that you know what she actually was." Dante was quiet for a long moment, turning the glass slowly, watching the ice catch the city lights. "She was perfect," he said finally, bitterly. "That's what I keep coming back to. Every memory I have of her, every laugh, every argument, every quiet moment,
I don't know anymore which parts were real and which parts were performance for an audience of one. I proposed to her in Tuscany at her family's vineyard, or the vineyard she claimed was her family's. I don't even know if that was true. He looked at Elena, something raw and exhausted in his eyes. I thought I knew what love was. Now I'm terrified I don't know anything at all. You know this, Elena said quietly, reaching for his hand. You know what's happening right now, between us. This isn't a performance, Dante. I'm not performing for you. I never have been, not really. Not since that first dinner when I couldn't stop my hands from shaking, and you held them anyway. Something in his face cracked open, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. How do I trust it, though, after everything? You don't trust it blindly, Elena said. You watch it. You test it, the way you'd test anything that matters, and you let me prove it to you, every day, for as long as it takes. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the tension in his body slowly, incrementally ease. I'm not going anywhere, Dante. Not because of a summit, not because of a woman hiding in the shadows, not because of anything she throws at us. I chose this. I chose you. That's not something she can fake her way into taking from us. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arms circling her shoulders, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the cold night air. Two people bracing themselves against a storm they both knew was coming, drawing whatever strength they could from the fragile, real thing they'd built in the eye of it. Isabella's next move came not as an attack, but as an invitation. A handwritten note delivered to the gallery on Halstead Street, addressed to Elena in careful, elegant script that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise the instant she recognized the handwriting from Sophia's earlier notes about art commissions. I think it's time we spoke honestly, one-to-one, the note read. Come alone to the old pier at Navy Pier's North Dock, tomorrow at dusk. If you bring Dante or his men, I disappear again, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering when I'll return. I only want to talk, Elena, woman to woman. I think you deserve to know the truth about the man you've fallen for. Elena brought the note to Dante immediately, watching his face darken with fury as he read it twice, then a third time. You're not going, he said flatly. Absolutely not. If I don't go, she disappears again, and we lose the only chance we have to understand what she's actually planning, Elena countered. Dante, she wants to talk. That means she wants something from me, which means I have leverage in that conversation, however small. Or she wants to kill you in a location isolated enough that no one can intervene in time, Dante shot back, his voice sharp with a fear he didn't bother disguising. I won't gamble your life on the possibility that she simply wants conversation. They argued for an hour, circling the same impossible calculation, the risk of the meeting against the risk of remaining blind to Isabella's plans, until finally Camilla, listening silently from the doorway, offered the compromise that broke the deadlock. Let her go, Camilla said, but not unprotected. We put surveillance on the pier from a distance she won't detect, rooftops, not the dock itself. Sal and two others, positioned far enough back that Isabella's own surveillance won't spot them, close enough to intervene within seconds if anything goes wrong. Elena goes in wearing a wire. We hear everything. If Isabella makes a single move toward violence, we're there before she can complete it. Dante resisted for another 20 minutes before finally, grudgingly, agreeing. And the following evening, Elena stood alone at the north dock of Navy Pier as the sun bled orange and purple into Lake Michigan, a wire taped beneath her collarbone, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away the deception before Isabella even arrived. Isabella emerged from the shadows of the pier's old carousel building precisely as the last light faded, dressed simply, none of Sophia's careful softness in her posture now, replaced by something colder, more regal, a woman who had spent 18 months rehearsing exactly this moment. "You look tired," Isabella said, echoing the same opening Sophia had used weeks earlier, and Elena understood it as a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of the friendship that had been nothing but calculated manipulation from the start. "You look like someone who faked her own death and let her husband grieve for 18 months, Elena replied, refusing to let the fear show in her voice. "Was it worth it? Whatever you were building?" Isabella's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You have no idea what I built, or what I sacrificed to build it. That house, that name, that empire. I earned every inch of it. 3 years of pretending to love a man I was sent to destroy. And then I gave it up, strategically, temporarily, to let a war I engineered weaken both families beyond recognition. And now I return to find some art forger from Halstead Street sitting in my chair, wearing my earrings, sleeping in my husband's bed." Her voice sharpened, the calm mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something ravenous and furious beneath it. "That life is mine, Elena. Whatever you've convinced yourself you feel for him, it doesn't change whose name is actually on that marriage certificate, whose blood runs in that family's future if I choose to let it." "He knows what you are now," Elena said. "He knows about the bombing. He knows you were never in danger. Whatever leverage you thought you had over his ignorance is gone." Something flickered behind Isabella's eyes, surprise quickly masked, followed by a recalculation Elena could almost watch happening in real time. "Then he knows I'm not someone to be underestimated," Isabella said finally, "which should frighten you more, not less. A woman with nothing left to lose is far more dangerous than one still playing at grief." She stepped closer, close enough that Elena could see the mole beneath her eye, identical to her own, a mirror twisted into something venomous. "I'll give you one chance to walk away, Elena. Leave Chicago, leave Dante, take whatever money he's paid you and disappear, and I promise you'll live to spend it. Refuse, and I promise you something far worse than a bullet." "What did you do to the real woman whose ring you left on that hand?" Elena asked quietly, the question that had been building in her since Dante first told her the story of identification. Was she innocent? Did she have a family who's still waiting for her to come home? Isabella's expression went utterly still, a stillness far more frightening than any anger could have been. "Careful," she said softly. "You're asking questions you don't want answered, in a conversation you don't have the power to control." She stepped back, melting toward the shadows of the carousel building as quickly as she'd emerged. "Consider my offer. You have 3 days before I stop being generous.
She vanished into the dark, and Elena stood alone on the pier, shaking, as Sal's voice crackled urgently through the earpiece hidden beneath her hair, confirming they'd heard everything, confirming Dante was already moving toward her position, his voice beneath Sal's, a low, furious litany of her name. The revelation of an innocent, murdered woman, used solely to fake Isabella's death, her identity never even acknowledged in Isabella's careful non-answer, settled over the penthouse like a shroud in the hours after Elena's return from the pier, and Dante's fury, which had been simmering beneath careful control since the discovery of Isabella's survival, finally found somewhere to go. "She's not just dangerous," he said, pacing the study while Camilla worked a laptop at the desk, cross-referencing every missing persons report from 18 months earlier that might match a woman used and discarded to fake a death. "She's willing to sacrifice anyone, use anyone, destroy anyone who stands in the way of what she wants. And what she wants now is you gone and me alone, vulnerable, ready to be reclaimed the moment she decides the timing serves her." "We found her," Camilla said suddenly, turning the laptop screen toward them, a grainy DMV photograph pulled up alongside a police report. "Maria Alves, 26, worked as a hostess at a restaurant on Taylor Street, the same restaurant where the bombing supposedly took place. Reported missing 3 days before the explosion. No family in the country to push for an investigation. The police report was closed within a month, ruled an unrelated disappearance." Camilla's voice had gone hard, grief and fury tangled together for a woman she'd never met, but whose death had been engineered entirely for someone else's convenience. She used this girl's death to buy her own freedom, and no one ever looked twice, because everyone believed the ring on that hand belonged to Isabella Moretti. Elena felt sick, the full weight of Isabella's ruthlessness finally crystallizing into something concrete. Not simply a scorned woman reclaiming what she believed was hers, but someone who had orchestrated an innocent murder as casually as she'd orchestrated everything else. A woman for whom other lives were simply raw material to be shaped toward her own ambitions. "We take this to the summit," Dante said grimly. "Not the peace negotiations themselves, that stays intact whatever else happens, but privately, to Salvatore Cardinali before the summit convenes. If he doesn't already know his daughter is alive and orchestrating a private war beneath the peace talks, he needs to understand exactly what she's willing to do to protect her own ambitions. And if he does know, if he's been complicit in this the entire time, then the war we thought was ending was never real to begin with, and we need to know that before we sign anything." "That's a significant risk," Camilla warned. "If Salvatore doesn't know, revealing his daughter's survival to him directly could destabilize the Cardinali family entirely. Internal factions forming around whether to support Isabella's return or condemn her deception. If he does know, you've just told your enemy that you know his plan, which removes any element of surprise you currently hold." "I'm aware of the risk," Dante said, "but I'm done playing defense against a woman who's 3 moves ahead of us in a game we didn't know we were playing. I want Salvatore Cardinali to understand exactly what kind of woman his daughter has become, and I want him to have to choose, publicly, whether he stands behind her or behind the peace his own family desperately needs." Elena, listening from the corner of the room, felt the shape of the plan solidify into something with genuine promise. Not simply defense, but a calculated offense that used Isabella's own ruthlessness against her,
forcing her father to weigh loyalty against strategy in a way that might fracture the very support she'd built her return around.
"There's something else," Elena said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke it. "She offered me a choice at the pier. Leave or face something worse than a bullet. What if I don't disappear, and I don't ignore her either? What if I meet with her one more time, and this time I'm the one setting the trap?" Dante's expression sharpened with immediate alarm. "Absolutely not. She's already proven she's willing to kill. She's willing to kill people who threaten her plans quietly, from the shadows," Elena interrupted. "But she wants something more than my death, Dante. She told me herself. She wants Salvatore, or whoever she's building loyalty within, to see the moment she reclaims everything, publicly, with an audience. If I can draw her into a confrontation where the right people are watching, at the summit itself perhaps, or somewhere close to it, we don't just neutralize her plan, we expose her in front of the exact audience she's been trying to manipulate for 18 months. The room went quiet, the audacity and danger of the idea settling over all three of them at once. "It's reckless," Camilla said finally, "and it's also, possibly, the only move that ends this permanently instead of simply delaying the next attack." Dante crossed to Elena, taking her face in both hands, his eyes searching hers with a fierce, terrified intensity. "If anything happens to you," he said, voice rough, "I don't survive it, Elena. Not this time. Not after everything." "Then make sure nothing does," Elena said softly, covering his hands with her own. "Trust me to do this. Trust us to do this together." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, a vow disguised as an embrace, and when he finally pulled back, his voice had steadied into the cold, controlled calculation of a man preparing for war. "Then we plan carefully," he said. "Every detail, every contingency. I am not losing you to that woman's ambition, Elena. Not after everything she's already taken from both of us." The Peace Summit convened in a converted ballroom at a hotel on neutral ground in the northern suburbs, guarded by soldiers from 6 different families who had agreed for one carefully negotiated evening to set aside decades of violence in pursuit of an uneasy détente that everyone in the room understood could collapse at the smallest provocation. Elena entered on Dante's arm, dressed in deep crimson rather than Isabella's usual palette, a deliberate choice, Camilla's suggestion, a subtle signal to anyone watching closely that the woman standing beside Dante Moretti tonight was building an identity distinct from the ghost she'd been hired to resemble. The distinction mattered more than Elena had initially understood. Camilla had explained, in the tense days of preparation, that Isabella's entire strategy depended on conflating Elena's identity with her own, making it easy to slip into Elena's life and claim it as rightfully hers. Wearing crimson instead of emerald was a small act of rebellion, but a meaningful one. Salvatore Cardinali arrived 20 minutes later, and Dante requested a private word before the formal proceedings began, a request unusual enough to draw curious glances from the assembled captains and consiglieres, but not unusual enough, in a room full of men accustomed to private negotiations, to raise genuine alarm. They met in a small side room, Salvatore's expression carefully neutral as Dante closed the door behind them, Elena standing silently at his side, watching the older man's face for any flicker of foreknowledge. "I have something to show you," Dante said, without preamble, sliding a photograph across the small table between them. The same photograph from his study,
Isabella laughing at the vineyard, unmistakably alive.
Salvatore's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked, to Elena's careful observation, like genuine and total shock. "This is impossible," Salvatore said, his voice quieter than Elena had heard it at the gala weeks earlier. "My daughter died 18 months ago. I identified—" He stopped abruptly, the sentence hanging unfinished, and Elena understood in that pause that Salvatore had never actually identified Isabella's remains either, had simply accepted the story his own family constructed around her supposed death. "You never identified anything," Dante said, watching the older man's face carefully, "because there was nothing of your daughter to identify. She staged the bombing herself, Salvatore. She used it to fake her death and disappear into your organization's shadows, building leverage against both our families for the past 18 months, while we all believed we were fighting a war she engineered from the start." Salvatore sat down heavily, the careful composure of a decades-long crime boss cracking under the weight of a betrayal he clearly hadn't anticipated. "You're certain of this?" "Completely," Dante said. "She's been operating under the name Sophia Renzi, manipulating people close to me, attempting to sabotage this very peace we're trying to build. I have surveillance, testimony, and a confession of sorts, delivered to Elena directly 3 nights ago." Salvatore's eyes moved to Elena for the first time since they'd entered the room, something calculating and pained moving across his weathered features. "And what does she want now?" "Everything," Elena said quietly. "Your organization's loyalty, my death, and Dante's empire reclaimed as her own. She's planning to expose this arrangement publicly at this summit, to destroy the peace and reclaim her old life in the chaos that follows." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of his daughter's face, laughing at a vineyard she'd used to infiltrate an enemy family. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that aged him a decade in a single sentence. "I built an empire on the assumption that my daughter died a martyr's death in service of our family. If she's alive, and she's been running her own game against both of our houses for 18 months, then she's not simply a traitor to the Morettis." He looked up, meeting Dante's eyes with a grim, decisive clarity. "She's a traitor to me as well, and I do not tolerate traitors, regardless of blood." "Then we're in agreement," Dante said. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever she attempts, we handle it together, not as enemies negotiating an uneasy peace, but as 2 men who've both been deceived by the same woman, working toward the same end." Salvatore extended his hand, and Dante shook it, the first genuine, unguarded gesture of alliance Elena had witnessed between the 2 families since this entire ordeal began. "She'll come tonight," Salvatore said grimly. "If she believes I don't yet know the truth, she'll try to use the confusion of the summit to make her move. We should let her believe that for as long as possible." They returned to the main ballroom separately, 5 minutes apart to avoid suspicion, and Elena felt the weight of what was coming settle over her like a held breath. The confrontation Isabella had been building toward for 18 months, about to unfold in a room full of the exact audience she'd always intended to witness her return. Isabella made her entrance at precisely the moment the summit's formal proceedings reached their most delicate point, the reading of a treaty both families had spent months negotiating,
a document meant to end 3 generations of bloodshed with careful, deliberate language designed to satisfy honor on both sides without requiring either family to admit weakness. She walked through the ballroom's main doors dressed in white, a deliberate, theatrical choice that Elena recognized instantly as calculated for maximum shock. A resurrection staged with the precision of a woman who had spent 18 months rehearsing exactly this moment, exactly this entrance, exactly the gasps that rippled through 300 assembled guests as they recognized with escalating horror the face of a woman they'd believed dead for a year and a half. "Forgive the interruption," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent ballroom, every syllable performed for the audience she'd built this entire moment around. "But I couldn't allow this piece to be signed on a foundation of lies." Dante's hand found Elena's beneath the table, gripping hard, and Elena felt Salvatore go rigid on his other side, the older man's face carefully arranged into an expression of shock that Elena knew now was entirely performed. "Isabella," Dante said, rising to his feet, his voice carrying the cold, controlled fury of a man who had rehearsed this confrontation a dozen times in his head over the past week. "How generous of you to finally rejoin the living." A murmur rippled through the room, confusion at Dante's lack of surprise beginning to spread among the assembled families. "You knew," Isabella said, her composure flickering for the first time, some genuine surprise breaking through the performance. "How long?" "Long enough to understand exactly what you've built these past 18 months, Dante said, stepping around the table, positioning himself between Isabella and Elena with a deliberate, protective precision. "Long enough to understand you staged your own death using an innocent woman's murder, Maria Alves, whose family never received an answer for her disappearance because you needed a body no one would look at too closely." The room's murmur sharpened into open shock, and Elena watched Isabella's carefully constructed narrative begin to unravel in real time, the audience she'd built this moment for turning, incrementally, against her instead of toward the sympathy she'd clearly intended to command. "I did what was necessary to survive," Isabella said, her voice rising, the performance cracking further as genuine desperation began to bleed through. "This family," she gestured toward Salvatore, "sent me into that marriage as a weapon, expected me to extract everything valuable and disappear when the mission was complete. I simply refined the plan to serve myself instead of serving him." "You murdered an innocent woman," Elena said, standing now beside Dante, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. "You manipulated me, pretended to be my friend, tried to convince me the man I love was a murderer, all to protect an ambition built on someone else's death. That's not survival, Isabella. That's just cruelty, dressed up as strategy." Isabella's eyes snapped to Elena, something venomous and unhinged flickering behind the careful composure. "You have no right to speak to me about cruelty. You're wearing a life that was never yours to begin with. My husband, my name, my earrings, my entire existence stolen and worn like a costume because you happened to share my face." "I never wanted any of it," Elena said quietly. "I was hired to perform a role, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with a man who deserved better than the lies you built your entire marriage on. That's not theft, Isabella. That's just what happens when someone real finally walks into the space you left empty. Salvatore rose slowly from his seat, and the entire room's attention shifted to him, understanding instinctively that whatever he said next would determine the trajectory of everything unfolding. "You are no longer welcome in this family," Salvatore said, his voice carrying the weight of a man delivering an execution order in front of witnesses. "You murdered an innocent to fake your death, manipulated your own family's war strategy for personal ambition, and attempted to sabotage a peace this family desperately needs. I do not know the woman standing in front of me. My daughter died 18 months ago, and whatever survived that bombing is not someone I recognize as blood." The words landed like a physical blow, and Elena watched something break entirely behind Isabella's eyes, the last vestige of her careful, patient strategy collapsing into raw, desperate fury. "You'll all regret this," Isabella hissed, backing toward the ballroom's side entrance, one hand slipping beneath the folds of her white dress. "Every single one of you." And then, before anyone in the room could react, she drew a small pistol from the concealed holster at her thigh, aiming directly at Elena, her finger already tightening on the trigger with the cold, practiced precision of a woman who had killed before and felt no hesitation in doing so again. Time slowed in the way it only does in the seconds before violence, and Elena had one clear, terrifying thought. This is how it ends. Before Dante moved, his body crossing the space between them with a speed that defied the careful, controlled man she'd come to know, throwing himself between Isabella's gun and the woman he loved with no hesitation at all. The shot rang out through the ballroom like the end of the world, and screams erupted around them as 300 guests scattered from tables, security teams from 6 different families drawing weapons in a chaos that threatened to spiral into exactly the war the summit had been convened to prevent. Elena caught Dante as he stumbled, blood already blooming dark across his shoulder where the bullet had struck. And her own scream tore from her throat as she lowered him to the ground, her hands pressing uselessly against the wound, warmth spreading between her fingers. "Dante, Dante, look at me. Stay with me." "I'm all right," he gritted out, though his face had gone pale, sweat beading at his hairline. "Elena, I'm all right. It's just the shoulder." Around them, chaos had erupted fully. Salvatore's men had moved on Isabella the moment the shot rang out, tackling her before she could fire a second time, wresting the pistol from her grip while she screamed obscenities and struggled against the men who had, 20 minutes earlier, been her father's loyal soldiers. Sal and 2 others from Dante's security detail converged on the scene, one immediately pressing a folded jacket against Dante's wound, while another called for the emergency medical team stationed discreetly outside for exactly this contingency. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet," Elena said, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face as she cradled his head in her lap. "You absolute fool. Why would you?" "Because I would rather take 100 bullets," Dante said, his voice weak but steady, his hand finding hers despite the pain visible in every line of his face, "than watch her take you from me, the way she took everything else." The medical team arrived within minutes, stabilizing the wound and confirming, to Elena's overwhelming relief, that the bullet had missed anything vital, lodging in muscle and tissue that would heal with time and surgery, but posed no immediate threat to his life. Isabella, meanwhile, was restrained by Salvatore's own men, her white dress stained with the chaos of her failed final gambit, her face contorted with a fury that had finally, completely, stripped away every careful mask she'd worn for 18 months.
"This isn't over!" she screamed, as they dragged her toward a side exit, toward whatever fate her father's justice had in store for her. "I built that empire. I earned every inch of it. You cannot simply erase me."
"You erased yourself," Salvatore said quietly, following behind his restrained daughter with an expression of grim, exhausted grief. "The moment you chose an innocent woman's death to buy your own freedom, you stopped being anyone I recognize as family." The ballroom slowly settled into a stunned, uneasy quiet as Isabella was removed, the summit's remaining attendees clustering in shaken groups to process what they'd just witnessed: an attempted assassination, a resurrection, and a betrayal so total it would be discussed in hushed tones across every Mafia family in the city for years to come.
Elena rode with Dante to the hospital, refusing to leave his side even as the medical team worked to stabilize him further, her hand gripped tight in his throughout the entire terrifying transit. And it was only once the surgeons had confirmed he would make a full recovery, once she was allowed back into his recovery room hours later, that she finally allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing against his uninjured shoulder while he stroked her hair with his good hand. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "After everything, after all of it, I thought that was how it ended." "I'm not going anywhere," Dante murmured into her hair, his voice thick with exhaustion and something that sounded unmistakably like relief. "I told you, Elena. I would rather take every bullet in that room than lose you."
"I meant it. I still mean it. You need to stop doing reckless, terrifying things to protect me," Elena said, half laughing through her tears, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade into something like hysterical relief. "I make no promises," Dante said, pressing a weak but genuine smile against her temple. "Not when it comes to you." The weeks following the summit unfolded with a strange, aching tenderness that neither Elena nor Dante had allowed themselves to fully imagine during the chaos of the preceding months. A slow, careful rebuilding of trust and safety in the wake of violence that had nearly cost them everything. Isabella's fate, Elena learned through Camilla's careful updates, had been decided quietly, through channels neither the police nor the public would ever fully understand. Salvatore Cardinali's own justice, delivered to a daughter who had betrayed not only the Moretti family, but the very organization that had sent her into that marriage in the first place. Elena didn't ask for details, and Camilla didn't offer them. And something in the careful silence between them told Elena that some closures were better left unexamined, their exact shape less important than the certainty that the danger had finally, definitively ended. The peace treaty, remarkably, survived the summit's chaos, Salvatore's swift, decisive rejection of his own daughter having, if anything, strengthened the trust between the two families rather than shattering it. Both patriarchs understanding now that they'd both been manipulated by the same woman's ambition, both equally determined to build something more stable in the wreckage of her betrayal.
Dante's recovery progressed steadily, though Elena noticed in the quiet moments of his convalescence a new gentleness in him that hadn't existed before the shooting, as if nearly losing everything had stripped away whatever remained of his careful, guarded distance, leaving behind a man who reached for her hand without hesitation, who spoke his feelings aloud without the armor of calculation he'd worn like a second skin when they'd first met. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, 3 weeks after the summit, as they sat together on the penthouse terrace, watching the lake turn silver beneath the rising moon, his arm resting carefully around her shoulders, avoiding the healing wound at his shoulder. "About what comes next. For us." "What do you mean?" "You were hired to play a role," Dante said quietly. "A dead woman's ghost, brought back to life for exactly as long as the summit required. That arrangement is finished now. The danger's past. You're free to go back to your gallery, your life, whatever you want it to be, without any further obligation to me or this family." Eleanor's chest tightened, an old fear resurfacing, that despite everything they'd survived together, despite the love they'd both spoken aloud in the fire of crisis, some part of him still saw their relationship as transactional, temporary, bound to the terms of a contract rather than the choice of two people who genuinely wanted each other. "Is that what you want?" she asked carefully. "For me to go?" "God, no," Dante said, turning to face her fully, his expression fierce and vulnerable all at once. "That's not what I'm saying, Eleanor. I'm saying I want you to choose this, choose me, not because a contract obligates you to, not because danger forced us together, but because it's genuinely what you want, free of every complication that brought us here in the first place." He took her hands in both of his thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles. "I love you. Not the memory of her, not the role you were hired to play, not the woman who happened to share her face. You, Elena Marchetti, the painter who forges masterpieces in a gallery on Halstead Street, who held my hand steady the first time I ever felt afraid in front of another person, who chose to keep fighting beside me even after you learned exactly how dangerous that choice would be." He drew a slow breath, something in his eyes shifting toward a vulnerability she'd rarely seen from him. "I'm asking you to stay. Not as an employee, not as a temporary solution to a political problem. As the woman I want to build the rest of my life around, if you'll have me." Elena felt tears rise unbidden, the weight of the past 3 months finally settling into something whole and real and undeniably hers. "I already chose you," she said softly. "Weeks ago, if I'm honest with myself. Long before the contract ended, long before any of this became something either of us could safely name." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I'm not going anywhere, Dante. Not because of obligation. Because I love you too. And I have for longer than I let myself admit." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that carried none of the desperate urgency of their earlier encounters, only a quiet, settled certainty. Two people who had survived every trap and betrayal thrown between them, finally allowing themselves to simply be together, without ghosts or contracts or danger standing in the way. 6 months later, the gallery on Halstead Street had a new sign above its door, Dante Moretti Fine Art, a partnership Elena had resisted at first, embarrassed by the suggestion that her work needed Dante's name attached to legitimize it,
until he'd pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that the gallery's newfound success had far more to do with her talent than his family's reputation, and the joint name was simply an acknowledgement of the life they'd built together rather than a crutch for her career. The gallery had indeed flourished, word of Elena's genuine artistic talent spreading through Chicago's collector circles once she stopped forging other artists' work and finally began exhibiting her own original pieces, portraits and landscapes that carried an emotional weight collectors described as unusually raw, unusually honest, the visible fingerprint of a woman who had spent months learning to distinguish authentic feeling from careful performance, and had emerged from that education with an artistic voice sharper and more distinctly her own than anything she'd produced before. Camilla had become, in the months since the summit, something between a mentor and a genuine friend, visiting the gallery weekly under the guise of business consultation that had evolved organically into long lunches and honest conversations about the family Elena had married into, the complicated history of loyalty and violence that came with loving a man like Dante Moretti. "You handled all of this better than she ever did," Camilla said one afternoon, nodding toward a portrait Elena had painted of Dante. Not commissioned, simply created in a quiet evening when she'd wanted to capture the particular tenderness he showed, only when he thought no one was watching. "Isabella was clever, cara, cleverer than almost anyone I've ever known. But she was never real. Everything she built was performance, calculation, strategy. You," Camilla gestured at the portrait, at the gallery, at the life Elena had constructed in the wreckage of someone else's deception. "You built something true. That matters more than cleverness ever could, in the end." Dante found her that evening in the gallery, working late on a new commission, and settled into the worn leather chair in the corner that had become, over the months, unofficially his. The Mafia boss, who'd once terrified an entire ballroom, now content to sit quietly for hours, watching the woman he loved lose herself in her craft. "I have news," he said, once she'd set down her brush, wiping paint from her fingers with the same practiced motion he remembered from the very first evening they'd met. "The Cardinali Moretti alliance has held for 6 months now. No incidents, no violations. Salvatore's asked me to stand as godfather to his grandson, born last week. It's as close to genuine peace as this world has seen in 3 generations." "That's wonderful," Elena said, meaning it, understanding now the full weight of what that peace represented. Not simply an absence of violence, but the slow, difficult work of 2 families choosing trust over the momentum of old grievances. "There's something else," Dante continued, and something in his voice made her set down the rag entirely, giving him her full attention. He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box that made her breath catch instantly. "I know we've built something already, a life, a partnership, everything I never thought I'd have again after Isabella. But I want to ask you formally. Not because a contract requires it, not because any danger demands it, simply because I love you. And I want the entire world to know it, the way I was too afraid to know it myself for most of my life." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not sapphires, Elena noticed immediately, deliberately different from anything Isabella had ever worn, a deep, warm emerald that caught the gallery's evening light like something alive. "Elena Marchetti," Dante said, kneeling now in the middle of the gallery she'd built, surrounded by canvases that carried her own true voice, rather than anyone else's borrowed identity.
Will you marry me? Not as a performance, not as a role, as exactly, entirely yourself. Elena felt tears rise, warm and unashamed, as she looked down at the man who had once mistaken her for a ghost, and had, over the course of a single, terrifying, transformative year, learned instead to see her fully, completely, as her own person, rather than anyone else's reflection. Yes, she said, pulling him up into a kiss before he could even finish sliding the ring onto her finger. Yes, Dante, 1,000 times yes. Their wedding took place the following spring, in the same vineyard in Tuscany where Dante had once proposed to a woman who had never truly existed. A deliberate choice Elena had suggested herself, understanding instinctively that reclaiming that particular ground, transforming it from a memory poisoned by deception into something genuinely joyful, mattered more to both of them than avoiding the echo of the past. The ceremony was smaller than either of their families' typical extravagance might have suggested, populated by people who had actually earned their place there, rather than the sprawling political guest lists of Mafia tradition. Camilla, radiant with genuine happiness as she stood as Elena's matron of honor. Sal and the small security detail who had protected them both through the worst of the crisis, now genuinely fond friends rather than merely employees. Even Salvatore Cardinali, present at Dante's own invitation, standing as living proof that the peace they'd built together had outlasted the woman who'd tried to destroy it. I never imagined I'd stand at a Moretti wedding as a welcomed guest rather than a wary rival, Salvatore said, raising a glass during the reception, his weathered face carrying the particular relief of a man who had watched his own family's darkest impulse finally, decisively, defeated. But then, I never imagined peace at all, until the two of you proved it was possible. To Dante and Elena, may your house stand stronger than any war either of our families has ever fought. The toast was met with genuine applause, warm and unguarded, and Elena, watching from beside her new husband, felt the full weight of everything they'd survived finally settle into something like peace of her own, not the fragile, temporary ceasefire of a political summit, but the real, hard-won stability of two people who had faced down every possible betrayal and chosen, again and again, to build something true instead. Isabella's fate remained, by unspoken agreement, a subject neither Elena nor Dante discussed at length. Camilla had once mentioned briefly that Salvatore's justice had been thorough and final, delivered far from any court that might have complicated the peace treaty with public scandal, and Elena had chosen deliberately not to ask for details beyond that. Some ghosts, she'd learned, were better left in the past entirely, their exact fate less important than the certainty that they could no longer reach into the present to cause harm. That evening, as the reception wound down into the soft golden hour of a Tuscan sunset, Dante found her at the edge of the vineyard, looking out over rows of grapevines that had witnessed both his greatest deception and his truest joy. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a year spent learning every version of comfort she needed. "None," Elena said, and meant it completely. "I walked into all of this by accident, a resemblance, a contract, a job I took because I was frightened and needed the money. I never expected to find something real in the middle of a lie built to protect a criminal empire. She turned to him, studying the face that had once terrified her in a rain-soaked gallery, now as familiar and beloved as her own reflection. But I'm glad I did. Every terrifying, impossible moment of it. I wouldn't trade any of it, because it led me here, to you. To us, Dante corrected softly, pressing a kiss to her temple, his other hand resting against the small curve of her stomach, still barely visible beneath her wedding dress, but growing, week by week, into a future neither of them had dared imagine possible during the darkest days of Isabella's manipulation. A family. Something real, built from something that started as a lie, but became, through nothing but our own choices, entirely true. Elena leaned into him, watching the sun sink low over the vineyard, where a dead woman's ghost had once haunted every corner of Dante Moretti's carefully guarded heart, and felt, for the first time since a stranger had walked into her gallery and looked at her like a resurrection, entirely, unshakably certain of exactly who she was. Not a ghost, not a performance, not anyone's borrowed reflection, simply, finally, herself. And loved, completely, for exactly that reason. The vineyard's evening bells rang softly in the distance, marking the hour, and Dante Moretti drew his wife closer against the coming dusk, the empire behind him finally at peace, the woman beside him finally entirely real, and the future ahead of them, for the first time in either of their lives, genuinely, uncomplicatedly bright.